This short training segment is going to cover infantry firepower, or small arms firepower. It is recommended that the players have a copy of the combat charts alongside them, so they can follow along with the examples which I'm going to be forthgiving. They can check how I do the calculations and do the tabulation, and determine how I came about the results. First thing that needs to be decided when it comes to infantry fire is what type of firing class you are. There are 3 firing classes: Class A, Class B, and Class C. In this example, the French are rated as Class B, and the same for the Austrians, which is your typical rating for infantry of the period. In this example, I have a 9-figure French Léger battalion of line grade morale versus 2 Austrian line battalions, both again of line grade morale. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that there's this white template down on the foreground. This is known as the minimum fire zone for this particular Austrian battalion, and that becomes crucial when units are within the 2-inch range of an enemy unit, especially if it's a formed order unit like this is. It's got a 22.5 degree angle of firing arc for a total of 45, but it's split 22.5 each way, and extends out for 2 inches. Any units, once they go into the minimum fire zone, are subject to penalty fires if they try and do formation changes or facing changes, or they're going into final shock combat. It also has applications in opportunity fire and pass-by fire, but all those firepower types I'm going to cover in other videos. This is going to be straight up knock 'em down, brawl, musketry shootout. Now roughly the figures are about 3 inches apart, which in the game scale is roughly about 150 yards. Pretty far for a musket to shoot. But when you got a lot of guys shooting, eventually they're going to start causing infliction of damage upon each other. Now to calculate the base percentage, after you know what the firing class is, and since both sides are B, you then have to determine what type of firing line you're going to utilize to determine the base percentages. So if you looked at the chart, you'd see it's infantry and cavalry, and you're going to be firing at the max range or close order and building / disordered firing line, because you're not shooting at normal musketry range, which is 2 inches. So by definition, it is automatically maximum range firing. Then as you go to the right, you'll see there's a series of numbers, and this is the number of figures that you're going to be firing the unit at the possible target. Now let's go and discuss possible targets here. Theoretically, this battalion is going to shoot at this battalion straight ahead. It could, in theory, shoot over here, because it's certainly going to be within the arc, but then it would probably only get half the battalion's worth of fire. Or the player can make the election to do what we call as firing into the blue, which means any possible target that's within range, long or short, will determine the actual target matrix. In this particular example, I'm going to make it simple. This battalion is going to shoot straight in here. All 9 figures are certainly within range of 4 inches, and all can bear within the arc. So looking at the chart again under max range with 9 figures, and then coming down to a B-class firer, I see I have 2 choices of 2 percentages, 50% and 40%. Looking off to the left, you'll see there's 2 lines. One says massed enfilade within an inch or in a building, and the other line is linear / open order target. Well, the Austrian formation, since it's not massed, it's a single rank, is automatically going to be deemed a linear target. So the base percentage to hit is 40%. From that point onwards, you would need to go down into the firepower modifiers, and typically these are terrain modifiers or ranging type modifiers. Now, since none of them are going to apply, we've already applied the long range modifier because we used the special line for max range fire, and there's no terrain involved, the straight percentage of 40% is still going to hold true. So now take a set of percentage dice and roll. In this case, the colored dice is always deemed to be the 10s, so we have a 25 as the result. A 25 is less than 40, or equal to, therefore the Austrians lost a figure, and the player would push him to the side, or knock him over temporarily. Now remember, typically in infantry fire, especially if this is during the infantry mutual small arms fire, which this is, the Austrians are going to fire back at full effect, and since their table is exactly the same, max range, 9 figures, B-class fires at a linear target is again 40%, they would roll a set of dice. And in this case they rolled a 55. They did not score a hit because they rolled more than 40. Now the other thing that's left over is this battalion over here, since at least a couple of figures can fire at least half its strength. There's a rule in the game that battalions, if they can shoot, will always fire at least half their strength if they're formed units, rounding up. So that would be 5 figures. So they would get another shot with 5 figures. Looking at the chart, max range, 5 figures. The base is 15%. And they rolled a 43. So again, this battalion missed also. Basically what's going to happen now is that we have to go through the morale checks for the units which lost figures. In this case it was this firing line. So they would take a morale check, and they typically will start with a beginning value of 6. And if there's no other modifiers like officers in range or anything of that nature, they would have a 6 minus 1 figure loss, which is a 5. But there's a unique rule for large battalions of 8 figures or more that they gain 1 back. Therefore, they need a 6 to roll. So you get a 10-sided D, and as long as they roll a 6 or less, in this case a 4, they pass their morale. How to conduct morale checks I'm going to cover in another video segment. So I'm just going to skim through those types of rules. I'm really trying to concentrate on firepower here. Now let's say one of these sides had a movement phase and they decided to come forward, and it was the French move. And he wanted to step closer. Not to shock combat yet, but he wanted to close the range, shall we say. Like such. Now notice he's entered the minimum fire zone of the Austrian firing line. So if he ever had to do any formation changes or twitches or even try to rally, he's going to have issues. You can never rally in a minimum fire zone of a formed unit. So if you became morale disordered, you can't recover from that morale disorder until later, when he's out of a minimum fire zone. Otherwise, the firepower is just going to get that much closer. So when it comes up again to the mutual fire phase, instead of using the max range table, we're going to drop down to the line that says 3 or 4 rank / any column formation. Count the number of figures that can bear, 9 figures, and instead of the percentage being in the last round 40%, it's now going to jump up to 94%. 94 chances out of 100 to score a hit. That's what the table's representing. And that's because of 2 things. 1, we've closed into normal range of musketry. And 2, we've closed to within an inch. I'm assuming this distance of the white zone is an inch or less. Point blank range firepower now. So they're going to fire with effectively the same as if it was a mass target, because we use a little modifier of if you're within an inch, you automatically are shooting on the massed line. Again, if you looked at the combat charts, you would see that. So it's a base 94, there's no terrain modifiers, so the French roll their dice, they rolled a 12, they're going to cause the loss of another figure. Now the Austrians are going to shoot back, and they have 8 figures, but they're also in this point blank range, and their base is 83. And they rolled a 15, so the Frenchman falls over. Now over here, there's no firing, because you've got to be able to hit at least 2 figures of infantry when you shoot. You just can't do this little 1 figure on wing, 1 figure little winky things. So in this case, there's not 2 figures in the arc, so this battalion's not going to shoot. Now we have to take morale checks. The Austrians started with a 6, but they've lost 2 figures now, so it takes them down to a 4. But they originally started with 8 figures at the beginning of this fire phase, so they're going to get 1 back. That's a benefit for having very large formations. Otherwise, normal formations of less than 8 would not receive that benefit. So effectively, they're going to need a 5 to pass the morale. And they roll a 4. So they're hanging in there. French started with a 7. They're a little bit better than the Austrian line because they're leger. But they've lost a figure, but they also have the large figure modifier just like the Austrians. So it's a 7 minus 1 for the loss, but back 1 because their 8 figures are larger at the start of the fire phase. And they roll a 6, so they passed. Now if this firefight continued, and they just stayed where they are, you would be trading volleys, and eventually one of the sides or another will probably go into morale disorder and or rout. But mechanically for firing, it's that simple.